He'll get here.
He'll get here, yes, he will. Well, welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming out on such a beautiful, cold spring day. My name is Lori Restino. I direct the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems here at Vermont Law School. This presentation this evening is a combined effort. Actually, it's really the student group, food, ag, and law students who are fantastic at the law school, who represent students that have an interest in food and agriculture. Some come from a conventional farming background, some have done organic farming, some have done food production, some have even done wine. So we have really a rich program here, and they've done an amazing job putting this together. I want to thank them all and thank them for their partnership with the Center for Ag and Food Systems. And if you haven't had some of that wonderful food, some of which has been donated, especially the cheese, please help yourself. This panel is really about how we can all work together, and we need to, in order to have sustainable food systems. You might notice, a few people have, that we do not have conventional well represented on this panel. That was not something we intended. We consider this to be an ongoing conversation. There are many conversations that happen here at the law school about agriculture, and so we'll have more and endeavor to have more conventional representation. We did some outreach to a major company in the state, but that didn't pan out this time, but we still have an amazing panel, and I hope some really wonderful discussion and some input from you all out there. I'd like to introduce Margaret Shugart, who's the one responsible, really, who headed this presentation this evening, and I want to just give a little bit of information about her. She's originally from Texas. She's a second-year student at Vermont Law School, pursuing both a JD and a Master's of Environmental Law and Policy, She earned a Master's in Nutritional Anthropology from the University of Colorado in Boulder. Thank you. And conducted her thesis work in Bali, Indonesia, learning about protein getting from organic rice fields. She graduated in the recession and ended up in the wine world, earning her certified sommelier pin through the Court of Master Sommeliers. Margaret eventually moved back to Austin to sell natural wines, whatever that means, and turned her sights to law school when a pristine region in Texas was threatened by oil and gas development. Vermont Law School was an obvious choice for her. Her first moments in the area were spent at Feast and Fields Farmers Market in Barnard, and she knew she had found her home. After law school, she looks forward to settling down in the state with her partner, John, and their daughter, and becoming an active member in the food and farming community. Without further ado.
I'm happy to talk to you about natural wine. It's a thing. But tonight we're going to talk about Vermont, and really thrilled, thank you very much, very thrilled to have this panel here, and thrilled to continue these conversations, and also very thrilled to see so many people in the audience, students and community members. And thank you all for being here. I'm a 2L senator with the Food and Agricultural Law Society. We call ourselves FALS. This year we've had an incredible growth in participation and activities. Two of our amazing leaders, Dylan Post, and I don't know if Nico is here yet. I think she's still in class. But if Dylan can stand, and then I'd like all of the members of FALS in the audience to stand. There's also some over by the table helping. And I just want to give credit to this crew for all the incredible work that they've done this year. Some of the things that have taken place, we had a packed house for a screening and discussion of a film called Mountains of Resistance. It was about Thai and Mexican community farmers fighting mining projects in their area. Almost once a month, we are over at the Red Door Church preparing meals for the community, and we've offered a cheese making class. We've combined with Feast and Field to have an ice cream party. We have farm bill chats on a regular basis, trying to think about how to move legislation forward. Upcoming this week for students in the audience, we'll be inviting people to join us in a 21-day racial equity challenge. Look for the table in our hallway on Wednesday. And we've also been a co-sponsor in the Credible Fear interviews. and have been working with the Social Justice Mission Scholars, the Latin American Law Students Association, and the Black Law Students Association, and training people how to help those who may be deported to find their place and have their place here in the U.S. We also have a garden committee and an Earth Week committee, and we're reviving something called Food Talk Radio. So it's been a very busy year, and it's a really incredible group. So just want to give kudos to all the good work that they do. And I want to give kudos to this incredible panel as well. Tonight we have David Zuckerman, as you all may know, the Lieutenant Governor of Vermont. David has served in both the Vermont House of Representatives on the Natural Resources and Energy Councils, and has chaired, or committees, and has chaired the Agricultural Committee and served on the Ways and Means Committee. He's served as well in the Vermont Senate, where he was on the Agriculture and Education Committee. And he has been a farmer this entire time with his partner. He will be speaking tonight about the success of bringing the GMO labeling law to fruition here in Vermont. We have Brendan O'Neill as well. He's here tonight with Zuli Palacios, and they are from Migrant Justice. Brendan is a coordinator with the Milk with Dignity program, and Zuli is training to do her first presentation in English, which I think is really brave. We also have Dean David Mears. He's the Associate Dean for our environmental program and the Director of the Environmental Law Center. David has done a lot in his career. He's worked in Texas with the Texas Water Commission. He was the senior attorney for water quality with the Texas Natural Resources Conservation Commission. He was an assistant AG in Texas. And here in Vermont, he has been the director for the Environment and Natural Resources Law Clinic. And tonight he will be discussing, and the commissioner, he's just been the commissioner of the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. And tonight he'll be discussing water quality issues and broader systemic solutions. We have two farmers with us this evening, very thrilled to have both of them here. The first is Brent Beidler, and he's here with his wife, Regina. Brent and Regina have owned and operated a pasture-raised dairy farm in the Randolph Center since 1998. The farm was certified organic in March of 2000, and the farm management focuses on intensely managed pastures that are their foundation feed for their cows. Brent earned his animal science degree from UVM and has decades of informal hands-on learning while farming for himself and others. They're also farmer owners with Organic Valley. We had some of their cheeses here tonight, which I hope you had a chance to try. And we have Miles Hooper here as well. He's the owner-manager of Ayresbrook Goat Dairy, and he runs the farm with his partner, and they're raising their two sons there on the farm. Ayresbrook was founded in 2012 to be a catalyst for genetic improvement in goats and best management practices and education in the goat industry. So without further ado, David's going to take the mic, and we look forward to sharing a wonderful night of discussion with you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Margaret. Are all of these, they are on? Okay, great. I wasn't going to jump up there unless people really want me to, and each of us, but are you all happy sitting? All right. Well, thank you so much for putting this together. You and, I've forgotten her name, but Sarah came to my office a few months back to talk about what's the possibility of something like this and what would it be like, and we had a great conversation. It's really great to see the fruition of the work that the two of you and apparently many others have put in to make today possible. And I think one of the things in terms of, for me, we're all in this together, Victories and Solutions in Vermont Agriculture, is really about how do we have a food system. And a food system is both production, which many people here are a part of, as well as consumption, which everybody here is a part of, that works for both economic viability for producers, environmental sustainability for our land, and I think David is sort of the lead on that, and worker and producer economic dignity and benefit. And Brendan and all of us who work on farms, whether we own them or whether we also employ people on them, feel that all of that is part of the food system. And as we continue to venture forward in Vermont in thinking about these topics and having this discussion, I think we're in a pretty amazing place, because the folks in this room and the folks around this state who've been working on some of these topics for years are some of the leaders for these kinds of issues, frankly, all across the country. And we have an opportunity in Vermont to continue to chart a course that others will be looking to as sort of flagship, whether it's political policies, whether it's consumer awareness and consumptive policies, and whether it's worker rights and water quality and environmental protection policies, some of which are in law, but some of it is also in culture. And not everything has to be resolved through legal means if we have cultural push that also does a lot of it. It's also, I think, really important to point out that no one size fits all, no particular production method or size or style is perfect. In fact, none of our styles or production methods are perfect. We're all looking to improve. And that no farmer, not a single farmer that I know, has the intention of either denigrating the environment or denigrating their workers, or because it's their own land and their own people that they're working with. But sometimes the reality of the economics of farming forces decisions that not everybody wants to make. And that's a reality with respect to an 80-year food policy, really ever since World War II, of what I call a cheap food policy. And we can keep making things less and less expensive, but there are costs to that we don't really see when we just buy a product off the shelf. So I think what we're talking about here is recognizing that multiple bottom line in our discussion. And I look forward to hearing from the others in terms of either the arena they've been working in, or their operation, or visions and ideas of how some of these challenges can be incorporated into the cost of food, while at the same time trying to maintain accessibility to food, because not everybody can afford to maybe pay for food that has all the different externalities incorporated into it. And that's kind of the nut that we're trying to crack, I think, going forward, and why the United States created a cheap food policy in the first place. Because, in the words of Bob Marley, a hungry man is an angry man. And that's a reality if you look all around the world. Civil unrest occurs when your basic needs are not met. And so having food that's affordable keeps peace, frankly. So it's a complicated confluence of things. And then to briefly now addressing that in the big picture, I was very involved as a legislator in the efforts to start regulating GMOs in Vermont. I introduced a bill, I think the first bill back in 1999 as a representative. I don't know whether it's the first in the country or pretty early on in the country, but at the time, most people didn't even know the term GMOs back at that point. And worked for actually about 10, 12 years to try to move legislation around GMOs. And we passed a couple of small bills through the legislature, but really what happened over that time was a public awareness was growing around food, and I think we're seeing that manifested now far beyond GMOs, but people are looking what they're buying, what's in the food, where you're spending your dollars. But that awareness was growing all over the state, and it wasn't just because one hippie from Burlington was talking about GMOs, but it was happening because conversations were happening everywhere. Authors were starting to write books, and people were becoming more aware of it, not solely as something that is healthy or not for humans, but what does it mean for the agricultural production system? And that whole system thinking was really growing. And I actually left the legislature while that momentum was building. I finally found land with my spouse and we moved our farm, which meant I didn't live in my district anymore, so I couldn't serve. And during those couple of years, that groundswell had grown to a point in a demand for labeling. Just the idea that, again, as consumers are trying to pick their way through these issues of workers' rights or environmental impact or food production systems or humane treatment of animals. As you know, there's more and more labels forming all the time, almost to the point of being a bit confusing for many consumers. But that has really grew through those early 2012, 13, and I was back in the legislature in 14 when we did successfully pass the first GMO labeling law in the country, and or 2012, I guess, and then it went into effect in 2014 for all of about 3 weeks. When after $120 million of lobbying effort in Washington, D.C., they overrode our right to have that information. Folks thought it wouldn't be legal, but through actually a lot of legal work here at the law school, as well as counsel in Montpelier, we drafted a law that fit within the Constitution, and folks that didn't want information out there about that production system won by a huge lobbying effort in Washington. But there was still a huge victory there. There's still a huge expansion of knowledge about that aspect of food production. And as we're about to hear again, there are many, many other critically important aspects of food production that all go into that package of food that you buy and that you eat every single day. You are impacting livelihoods, water quality, air quality, animal husbandry, and humane treatment with every decision you make every single day. And I think that's part of what this conversation is about, is being all in it together. How do we move forward so that all of those different pieces are bolstered with your consumption? So I'm going to pass the opportunity to speak. I'll just go down the line. It doesn't really matter, does it, to you all? So Brendan O'Neill is a friend of mine. Actually, I will say, just for full disclosure, both his sister more so, but Brendan as well, when I was just starting my farm in the late 90s and early 2000s in the Intervale, worked for me, so they can both tell you stories about what I'm like as a boss, so we can skip that for now. But he's been working with Migrant Justice for many years. I don't know exactly how many, but I'll just turn it over and you can take over.
Thanks. And can you give me a warning?
Yeah, what do you think for time? I didn't quite get that note.
10 to 12 minutes, and I'm
Give me like
Okay.
a 2-minute
warning. You got it.
3-minute warning. I don't want to
There you
go
go.
too long just in case. Well, thanks, Dave. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for disclosing that you were my boss. That wasn't one of my experiences.
Now all of you are my boss, just so you know, right?
That wasn't one of the experiences that led towards the path of forming Migrant Justice. But yeah, I was reflecting on that.
Closer to the mic.
Can you all hear me okay? I was reflecting on kind of how I got to know you, and it's been great to witness kind of ideas that were in the activist realm for years and in the grassroots realm find champions inside, the State House and now, at various levels of government. I think it's an exciting shift that we are seeing here in Vermont on multiple issues. And it's something we can get a lot done in this state for that reason. I think that we can find alignment on a lot of these issues. But yeah, I'm just gonna kind of back up just in case folks don't know about Migrant Justice and Migrant Justice's work, why we exist, and then more recently, our work in what we call the Milk with Dignity program, which very much fits into what we're looking at here kind of across the food system in terms of where does our food come from? And in this case, that concept, I like this concept of the right to know. And really consumers have pushed. And now in a new wave of activism across the country really is happening. And a lot of it is around the food system in terms of what is the quality of the jobs that our food system is creating, and how do consumers know that, and how do we have kind of verifiable, reliable ways to do that. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that. But, first of all, Migrant Justice is a grassroots organization that started after the death of a young immigrant dairy worker from Chiapas, Mexico, back in 2009 on a dairy farm, was killed in a bad workplace accident. And that was kind of a spark that brought together farm workers and folks who had been connected in one way or the other to the farm worker community, predominantly immigrant farm worker community. Like myself, I'd been an ESL teacher. That had been my connection, and I got to know a bunch of dairy workers. And really, around that time, 2008, 2009, 2010, it was really the first time that it started to become even recognized that over the course of the past, let's say from about 2000 to the present, there's been a steady shift in the demographics of the labor force in the dairy industry, predominantly. And not just, I should say, not just conventional, depending on the size of some farms, some organic farms as well, have shifted to tap into what is basic common sense from a market perspective. You're gonna, this happens, right? Dairy is a tough industry. It's always struggled to have a reliable labor force. It's struggled to have good paying jobs. Farmers themselves struggle to pay themselves well. And in the surrounding states of New England, there were existing immigration networks. Immigration happens in networks. Those are often family networks. And you can just picture it doesn't take much for an existing network in New York or Massachusetts to reach into Vermont. So you have kind of the push and pull forces of immigration, right? One thing that's kind of interesting to think about from this perspective is many of the young dairy workers, immigrant dairy workers sustaining the Vermont dairy industry today are actually, a particular kind of way to think about it, are children of NAFTA. So they're actually, their parents were affected by food policy, agricultural policy, trade policy, that actually pushed millions of small corn farmers out of production, particularly in southern Mexico, because they couldn't compete with corn that was being dumped on the Mexican market in the United States. And where did these folks go? There was unemployment. Many migrated north. Some found jobs in sweatshops along the border, and others crossed the border. This is a logical kind of push force of why people migrate and cross borders. And then there's a pull force, which is an industry, as I mentioned, that's been looking for and struggling to maintain a reliable dairy labor force. So those two forces met up probably around the year 2000. It started to become a network that grew. And to this point in Vermont, most mid to large size dairies are in some shape or form rely on immigrant labor, predominantly from Mexico, predominantly young men. And Migrant Justice kind of exists in this new community to Vermont. It was founded based on a need. This particular community, as it first came to Vermont, was facing marginalization, isolation, all the things that rural Vermonters, particularly poor rural Vermonters, already face: transportation challenges, wage, and earning a livable wage, healthcare. All these things were kind of magnified and amplified by a lack of mobility or dependency, and some complicating factors around immigration status. So Migrant Justice kind of filled a new place by essentially, for the first couple of years, our sole focus was gathering workers together over a meal in community centers in Franklin County, Addison County, and the Northeast Kingdom. So it was almost an all volunteer-driven effort. We had monthly gatherings. We organized a transportation system. Workers showed up. shared experiences, and over time, that sharing of experiences started to lead into some analysis of what the community, this new community, needed and wanted to lead a good life in Vermont. And the first kind of couple things we focused on was very much organic process out of these spaces over food. And, you know, and these were kind of profound experiences at first as well, because this was literally sometimes uniting families who lived only 15 or 20 miles apart, but who never saw each other in these community spaces because they're working 60 to 8 hours a week, they don't have access to transportation, you know, various other obstacles and challenges. So these community spaces really became the space where the farm worker community in Vermont, immigrant farm worker community, defined for the first time its place and claimed its voice within the food system. And these were powerful moments when this community, for the first time, went into the Vermont State House in 2012 and 2013 and found plenty of lawmakers who wanted to know more about their experiences. Walked right in, found an open door, had access, and pretty soon workers got a need across and converted that into a significant piece of legislation. In 2012 and 2013, Migrant Justice launched a campaign based on working for access to driver's licenses regardless of your immigration status. At that time, there was only 2 states that had that as an option. That was New Mexico and Washington State. Workers in these community assemblies identified this as something that would significantly improve life. And of course, this was taking into account basically the failure of the federal government to do anything meaningful in terms of immigration reform. It's not that we don't think that's important, it's that it wasn't gonna happen. And right now it's not gonna happen. So the attitude was, well, what can Vermont do? What can we get done? And this was very significant and has transformed the lives of you know, hundreds, if not, you know, at least over 1,000 workers who now have access to driver's licenses thanks to this bill. From there, Migrant Justice's work focused a lot on policing. And then after that, we moved into, we kind of came full circle back to the workplace. After building an organization with hundreds of people participating, the question became, how do we ensure that there are a set of good standards in place that are enforced in the dairy industry, that both reward the dairy farms that are already doing the right thing and that develop best practices on those farms that aren't. So we designed something that we call the Milk with Dignity program, working with a group of farm workers from Florida who created something called the Fair Food program in the tomato industry. We adapted those concepts to Vermont agriculture, and we took the idea to Ben & Jerry's, and we said, we think that your consumers want this. We think that the Ben & Jerry consumer wants to know that they're eating ice cream that was produced under fair and dignified labor practices. And we think that if you pay farmers more, a premium on their milk, we can get this done, and this can be a win-win-win situation because we recognize that farmers needed a better price for their milk. And that idea took some time, it took some effort, it took some public campaigning and public pressure. But we, in October, signed the first agreement of its kind, where Migrant Justice signed a legally binding agreement with Ben & Jerry's, in which Ben & Jerry's commits to source its milk through what's called the Milk with Dignity program, meaning that farmers in Ben & Jerry's supply chain have to comply with what we call the Milk with Dignity Code of Conduct, which are fundamental workplace rights and housing rights for workers. So though it's a process, and we've always explained it that way, this isn't a gotcha approach. Farmers are working to come into compliance over time, and it's meant to put support systems in place to get there. We're on the road, and it's a pretty exciting time. The program's growing and expanding, and soon there'll be more buyers in it beyond Ben & Jerry's.
Thank you, Brendan. David.
Thank you. Thanks you all for being here tonight. I was just reflecting on the good food here tonight, which I very much appreciated. When I first stepped into my job at the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation, I got to work with the Secretary of Agriculture, Chuck Ross. And we had lots of reasons, I'll explain in a moment why, to work together pretty closely over the course of the time that we worked under the Governor Shumlin's administration. But one of the things I learned very quickly was that it was very important to go to meetings at the Agency of Agriculture because of the nature of the groups that they interact with and the constituencies. There was always amazing food. There was cheese and chocolate milk and ice cream, which was in such a contrast to my department, since we regulate wastewater treatment plants and have a different constituency. Thank you for whoever's responsible for that amazing array of cheese and meats and food. That was really lovely. I've been working on the issues of agriculture and water quality for virtually my entire professional career. When I first worked in the state of Texas, within about a year, I was moved into a program that was focused on water quality. There had been a big shift of large dairy farms from Arizona and California moved to Central Texas, Erath County, because I think it had something to do with milk pricing laws. I'm not sure exactly what it was. I think also the county had done a lot of work to roll out the mat to kind of welcome the dairy farm community and had created some veal processing and milk processing facilities to make it a really good deal for the dairy farms to come in. And they had come in and they had mitigated as they built their lagoons and their systems, the amount of rainfall that fell in Central Texas. I think they assumed it was the same level of arid, kind of conditions. And as a result, when it began to rain, once those dairy farms were in place, they began to flood and manure began flowing freely across the landscape, killing off stock ponds, wiping out streams. And it created a real cultural challenge for that community, which had long been an agricultural community. And saw itself as very supportive of farmers, but also was quite disrupted by this new group of farmers. And it was a fascinating experience for me to witness this intersection between the agricultural economy, the impacts of the economy, those economic decisions on the landscape and on the watershed. It also, I began to realize how complex the issues were beginning to tackle those issues, that the mix of economic, and water quality and scientific issues and tied together with political, socioeconomic, cultural issues were really a big challenge to sort out. And it was interesting also how it played out in the state. At first, in response to a large outcry from very long established ranchers in Erath County, the state moved aggressively to regulate the dairy farmers. And began quickly, and that was when I got pulled in. We were doing major enforcement action against these dairy farmers. But then there was a backlash. Then because of the economic power and the importance of the dairy farm community to Erath County, there was an equal and opposite reaction to that. And the program was removed from where I worked, the Environmental Regulatory Agency, and moved into the Agency of Agriculture. And so I got to see kind of firsthand as a line person, as a staff person, kind of watch that tension play out. And it stuck with me. And through the course of my career, I've interacted in the context of water quality and agriculture over and over and over again, because I've focused very much on water quality, and you cannot work really in any state in this country on water quality issues, whether it's Washington State, Texas, or Vermont, where you don't run into the challenges of the impacts of agriculture on watersheds. It's a real and present problem that has afflicted every state in this country. And it's a systemic problem, not a people problem. That's what I've taken from my experience, that there are some really deeply embedded systemic problems that drive farmers to make a set of choices about which crops they grow, about how they feed their cows, what they feed their cows, how they manage the waste. And they do it with, and it's unlike, a system in which, you think of the classic polluter kind of situation. And thinking back to the 1970s when there was this effort to stop the Cuyahoga River from bursting into flame by stopping the industrial discharges, where you identify a set of companies that have significant, capital investment potential. They have the money, they have the resources, they can hire the experts to do the work. When you think about farmers, certainly at the scale of Vermont farming, there are no polluters out there that bring those kind of resources. You can't just go out and start regulating and enforcing against farmers and expect that somehow magically that you're going to get the kind of improvements that we saw in the 70s and 80s when we regulated industrial dischargers. It's just a very different and much more complex set of challenges. So you've got this kind of interwoven, complex set of issues. You've got watershed management, which is in and of itself a major challenge. Whether you've got a combination of farms, you've got the suburban development, urban development. There's a whole set of ways in which we have channelized and managed our rivers, that we've destroyed wetlands, that we've cleared forests in ways historically that even as the forests recover, there's still long-standing harms that are a century or more older on our landscape. So managing our watersheds for better and cleaner water is complex enough without throwing agriculture into the mix. And then you throw agriculture into the mix, and when you look at the contributions of agriculture in nearly every watershed in the state, it's a major component of the pollution, and some more than others. If you go up in Franklin County and look at the impacts on Missisquoi Bay, it's quite dramatic. The percentage points I can't remember. Marley Roop, I see in the audience, who's an expert on this for Vermont DEC. Do you remember the percentages in Franklin County? 70, 80%, right? And then there's other parts of the state where it's much smaller, where it may be 10 to 20%. But there's no part of the state where agriculture is not a significant contributor to the amount of nutrients, sediment that flow into our waterways. And then there's a set of other issues that we're still getting our hands around in terms of the impacts of commercial fertilizers, pesticides, fungicides, and the like. So there's a set of impacts. Now, it's too easy to start thinking, well, if you can identify that farms are the problem, then let's design a set of policies and regulations that are just focused on farmers. And that's been the traditional response of the environmental community, of environmental regulators, of which I've been a part over the course of my career. But what I have learned is that if that's all you got, if that's the only set of tools you have is a set of environmental regulations, a set of requirements that drive people to in the case of a large dairy farm, that you have to have a lagoon sized at X level, you have to have, separate your clean water and your manure runoff, and you can only apply these times of years at this certain levels. If that's all you got, and you just impose on the farmers, you're actually playing into a deeper set of economic problems that have afflicted the dairy industry in the state and farming across the country for a long time. If that's all you've got, we're not going to solve the problem of farm pollution. Saying to a farmer, especially a mid-sized or a small-sized farmer who's working the 80, 90 hours a week to make a living, and say, we want you to also become an expert in engineering and in nutrient management. We also want you to think about new and alternative ways of farming. We want you to change the feeds for your cows. We want you to build a manure lagoon that's going to produce methane and produce energy. That's not going to happen. It's unrealistic. This is not DuPont. We're not going to be able to take a set of clean water regulations, apply them to a set of farms, and magically, poof, they're going to come into a set of compliance. It's also too simple to say that we're going to fix the ag economy in this state, which is struggling. And if you don't know that, you should. Right? It's not like our dairy farmers are actually making boatloads of money, wads of cash, and stuffing it under their mattress. Our dairy farmers are barely scraping by in this state. That's a consequence of a set of milk pricing laws, of competition from the West, of the challenges of farming and the scale and the weather conditions we have in Vermont. There are lots of reasons why our farmers are struggling. So it's not a matter of just throwing money at the situation. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have accountability, that we shouldn't have some way of ensuring that the actual costs to the environment aren't built into the food that we all pay for. But it's not so simple. It's not like we require farmers to come into compliance and they can magically pass those costs on to consumers. That's not how milk pricing works. Doesn't work that way. So we have to be more sophisticated. It's also not as simple. You know, I look forward to hearing the discussion about some of the other models. But as these gentlemen, I think, will explain to you, it's not as simple to just switch from, you know, a 200 head of dairy farm to some other, to pasture-based dairy, or to switch to goats. Right, you know, or vegetables, or to grow hops or hemp, or whatever the latest thing is. Those are all good things. We should be talking about how we move to that. But it's not as simple as just saying we've got, I'm out of time?
2 minutes.
It's not as simple as saying we've just got to magically switch. And one of the things I discovered in my time in state government was that there were a lot of people, a lot of snake oil salesmen who had the idea. They had the solution. So where I see, to kind of conclude, and I hope we have some time for dialogue around this, where I see the solutions in Vermont are, one, we can't compete with the West. You know, if you haven't had a chance to read some of Roger Albee's historic research on kind of the evolution and ebb and flow of the history of farming in Vermont, it's fascinating to read. Every few decades, we go through, we assign a bunch of people to do a deep study, and they come to the same conclusion, which is Vermont cannot compete on commodity markets with the West. Eventually, the West beats us up every single time. So if we're gonna stay ahead on agriculture, it's gotta be because we're innovative, we find new markets before those markets have even unfolded, and we're ahead of the curve, and we work as a community to help our farmers get there. Again, these are hardworking folks that are trying to make a buck off of their land. And if there was a better way to do it that didn't have pollution impacts, or there's a way to reduce the pollution impacts, they would be doing it. If you hear from the farm community, one of the biggest frustrations and complaints is, you keep changing the rules. You keep moving the yardstick. Tell us what to do and we'll do it. And I have to say, on the environmental side of things, we're working like crazy to try to figure out whether it's some combination of cover cropping, buffers along streams, you know, how do we handle tile drains? There's a whole set of highly complex, confusing issues to sort out, but we have to do it together. If there's one thing I've learned, and it was traveling around with Chuck Ross when he was Secretary of Agriculture, is when you talk to the communities around this state, collectively, we have the brain power to figure out how to move to a better system in which our farmers are making a good living off their land, and we have at least reduced or substantially impacted in a positive way the pollution impacts into our waters. So I hope we have some more time for discussion, but I'll conclude there.
Great. And next we have Brent Beidler.
Okay. Wow, David, thank you. Thanks to everyone who's put this together and invited. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. And looking out at your faces, it's interesting to see a lot of young people, and I see some people that I've known for a lot of years who've been farming for generations on this land in this area, and it's a real honor to be a part of this discussion, and it's a good one too. So I'll just tell a little bit of our story, and it's a little bit of the story of dairy farming for the last 50 years. I grew up in Quechee, which just south of here, and at the time that I grew up, it was an abandoned mill town. It was run down. It wasn't the address that it is currently, where there's a lot of condominiums and golf courses. We were picked on as kids. And my grandparents had a dairy farm in Pennsylvania, and that's where I caught the notion of farming, and that I wanted to be a part of this, because I would spend time with my grandparents. They had a 40-cow dairy and 13 children, and somehow caught sight of the fact that the connection between people and animals was wonderful. And that's where I got started. But living here in Vermont, there wasn't as much an opportunity to be involved with farming on a day-to-day basis, because I was just traveling back and forth as a child. So I very much connected with the local farmers in Quechee, in the community there. They were very happy to bring in young people that were interested, and that's very characteristic of the farming community, and actually the culture of all of Vermont, of bringing people along that want to be a part of the adventure of farming. And so I was the recipient of a lot of graciousness from the farmers I grew up with, the old men who allowed me to tag along. And in that day, it was conventional farming. I worked for a number of dairy farms, and then I attended college, but always with the notion that perhaps I would be lucky enough to own my own farm. But it was not a time to be very hopeful for that. Back in the 1980s, there was actually programs which were designed to encourage farmers to get out of milking cows, the whole herd buyout, and was a program where farmers were paid to send their animals to slaughter. And so when I was a child, there was 5,000 dairy farms in the state. And by the time we got started in 1998, we were down to 1,800. So that was 20 years ago. And today there's less than 800. So this has basically been a season of loss for the dairy farm community. And so it just is, it's with that context that I speak. And that it's the farm families that are lost along with that. The milk production has stayed the same. The cow numbers have stayed relatively the same, but it's all those farm families that have gone down in the last 45 years that causes me great concern. So as I was looking at the possibility of farming in my 20s, I got a chance to go to the University of Vermont, and there was a professor there, Bill Murphy, who was pioneering or adapting a model of grazing, which was called rotational grazing. So you basically divide up your pastures in order to get better production. And I saw this as an entree. I was working for a farmer that was trying some of these techniques and saw that grass farming was a way to get started without as much capital investment and without as much machinery involved, and also that it was a new way of thinking about farming, a slight departure from the model that I'd grown up with. But so that was the first time that I had a notion that there was actually a possibility to be farming on my own. And the grass farming was an entree for us as the organic market was starting to come along too. I was very disillusioned with the complexities of the conventional milk market, and the organic milk market was something different that I wanted to try. And the possibilities with that were because there was a market which was first of all consumer connected. Consumers were asking for information about the milk, how it was produced. And while it was in its infancy in the 90s and the early 2000s, when it came here to Vermont, it found a home with many of the small farms that were willing to adhere to the organic principles and to be able to become certified. And then there was a commercial market that developed. And that was a lifeline for a lot of the smaller farms in the state. Over time, more have come along to the point where we have about 200 today. So that's almost a quarter of our surviving dairy farms. And I believe a lot of them are there because there was a pricing mechanism which was based on the fact that farmers should first be paid a fair and sustained price, and that was the foundational part of at least a lot of the markets that we're developing. And that's been a struggle to always be able to do that. It's been a conversation, and there's been a lot of difficulties along the way being able to have the farmers be paid economically fairly, but as it's been a growing market with more and more consumers interested in the organic products, it has been successful for a lot of farms, but it's not the market for everyone, and not everyone has been interested in even participating in that. And so I guess I'll go back to the fact that I owe a lot of my opportunity in farming to all the different farms that were a part of my life, and most of them were conventional. I say that I'm the first, our farm is the first organic farm I ever worked on because that's the way it was. And I would also add that, you know, we're here today to look for bright spots and to hopefully discuss some things which can be beneficial for our community. I do believe that organic milk production is one of the bright spots. Grass-fed was something that we came to about 10 years ago. We started trying to find self-sufficiency on our farm and actually started growing some grain so that we could feed our herd by growing grain in this, and to feed our animals that way, and therefore not being dependent on the high-priced organic grain which we normally would be purchasing. In doing so, we discovered that it's very, very hard to grow grain in the state of Vermont. It's quite possible, and we had some success, but it would take many, many acres for me to be able to do that on a consistent basis. The other thing that we discovered is that there is tremendous interest in local foods, because as soon as we started growing grain, the locavores came out of the woods and demanded that we grind it into flour for them. And thankfully that is something that's been happening along the way. There's been this real interest in being supportive of agriculture in a local sense, and they've in some ways have carried along diversifications that have come along the way that are interested in markets. Consumers have been very supportive. And I think that perhaps now needs to broaden a little bit further from local to regional, to a notion that we just aren't many people here in Vermont. And we don't have that many mouths to feed. We have to think a little bit broader about our local outreach and the local products. And so part of the story that I was going to continue and say is that as we started growing grains for the people instead of our cows, we started to discover that grass-fed was very possible in cows, in the dairy industry. And so we discovered that our cows adapted well and were very healthy, and that's what motivated us to continue on. So you hear a lot about grass-fed these days, either the benefits or perhaps the need for standardization, but it's an emerging market that I think is perhaps as solid as any that we've seen in many years. There's real interest, and I think that Vermont is the state to grow grass in. It's the crop which wants to grow more so than anything else outside of trees. And capitalizing on that, our topography and our people really are adapted towards livestock production, cows in particular. Sorry, Miles. But that's my take on some bright spots for our future, keeping in mind what we have for our topography and our abilities, and I have a lot of optimism.
And Miles, you'll be next. I do want to remind folks that we will, if we're doing well right now, we'll have about 20, 25 minutes for a discussion. So think about questions you might want to ask either of the whole panel or a particular person up here when we get done with Miles. So, Miles.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. Very honored to be here tonight. There's some pretty heavy horsepower up here, so definitely very flattered to be invited. A lot of great points have been made so far. So I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Miles Hooper. My mother and her business partner with a handful of investors started Vermont Creamery in 1984. That business basically was sucking pond water for the first 20 years and then started to really get some legs. A year ago, next week, we will have sold our creamery. And one initiative that we took on in 2012 was to actually put our money where our mouth was, which was to go out and milk goats ourselves, because this market was growing, And for years and years, we kept going back to the farmers. This is my mother. And she says, you guys got to milk more goats because we need more milk. And, you know, it wasn't, we couldn't go out and say that without being able to empathize and sympathize with the actual struggles and challenges of profitably managing a dairy farm. Whether it's goats or cows, it's agriculture. I think all forms of agriculture are somewhat marginal, especially here in Vermont, which is a great point that David really emphasized, which was about looking, and Brent too for that matter, looking to other markets and developing a connection with the consumer so that we're not trying to compete in the same marketplaces as 5,000 cow dairies in the Midwest. This is what Vermont Creamery has been all about for 30 years. So anyway, 2012, the creamery rounds up some investors. We buy this amazing piece of land in Randolph, Vermont, and partnered with Vermont Land Trust to conserve the farm. And we got started on building, I hate the term, it's a demonstration farm. That was what it was, that's what its purpose was. But of course, I hate to say that because dairy farming is continued education. It's every day. And if you're not learning, then you're really not developing as a farmer and continuing to look for those best management practices that we all are, and those areas that we can all improve on. So, forgive me, I'm just kind of spitballing here. So fast forward 5 years, the farm we're milking 500 does. We got a total herd count of about 1,100. We are cropping a few hundred acres, and really have played around with many systems and ideas. I am as far from being set in my ways as possible. We try a lot of things and give it good time to let them prove themselves out, but certainly don't want to work around a hangnail, so to speak. If something's not working, you got to modify, be liquid, and move forward. So at the time, we were the largest producer. So at the time of the creamery sale, we were the largest producer for the creamery. There's about 20 farms making milk in Vermont. We had a few farms in Quebec, and some of that milk was coming from, a lot of the milk was coming from Ontario because the Vermont marketplace had been totally, we were buying all the available milk. And so lots of opportunity there. When we sold the creamery and had the ability to kind of be like, all right, we don't have, it's not our problem anymore. No, it allowed us to think about the farm in a different way, to redesign the farm in a way that really worked with our lifestyle, worked to create a business that was competitive to other industries. Milking at 5 o'clock in the morning and 5 o'clock at night, it can be challenging to find an employee that's willing to make that commitment, especially for the marginal take. So we really had the ability to kind of rethink what we were doing now that we no longer had to be the anchor for the creamery. And what came out of that was I actually downsized the farm. I sold a number of animals last year when I had the opportunity, and decided that maybe we could run the farm, you know, in a kind of more life-sized way. Figure out ways to simplify, figure out ways to reduce risk, okay? This is the biggest thing in dairy farming now, and of course, you know, I commiserate with Brent and others. You know, this is a season for loss in the dairy industry, and so it is also with that same context that I speak here. But I've always looked at the goats as really a potential alternative, an antidote to keep hillside farms productive. Because where I grew up in Brookfield, we hayed on a hillside that was so steep you couldn't even run a kicker wagon up there. So I very much identify with hillside farms as a part of my upbringing and character building and who I am, even though I farm the flattest piece of land in Orange County now. So I really thought that, okay, maybe a 40-cow dairy could transition and reinvent itself as a 200 milking goat farm that, you know, was the kind of thing that you could send your kids to college on. And the goat's milk category has been steadily growing in the United States in the last 30 years and has been very stable. I do get concerned that that it will destabilize over time, and think about that a lot. You know, I think the goats is now very much the way that organic was, the organic cow's milk was, 20 years ago. Is that fair to say? Yeah. And so we continue to have these pressures from out of state, but I think what we always have to do here in Vermont is continue to tell the story and to give a damn, and, you know, milk with dignity, and using best management practices to mitigate nutrient runoff and so forth. You know, and getting that information to the consumer, that is what will continue to keep Vermont relevant in dairy food production long term. You know, folks in Manhattan it's amazing. They will pay a lot of money for a little piece of cheese, you know. So, you know, we have to think about that and take advantage of that. The goats is a really interesting business. I think it has there are a number of challenges over dairy, starting with the sheer number of animals, and probably the fact that the genetic predictability in goats is like 30 years behind Holstein and Jersey Association. So we're working on it. Through some key partnerships with UVM, VTC, and so forth. Goat meat is the most widely consumed red meat in the world, okay? And there's a tremendous amount of frozen goat meat imported from Australia every year. Okay, this is a big opportunity. You know, goats are a unique critter in the sense that they have the ability to convert what would otherwise be just rubbish, wasteland, you know, like, you know, you think about the high transmission lines going across the mountainside. Well, goats could take all that underbrush and convert it to meat or milk, or, you know, and so there's big opportunities there. We have a great partnership with Pine Island Farm in Winooski. You know, you turn on WCAX around Christmas time and the goats are all eating all the Christmas trees from Burlington. So my focus, I'm getting the flag here. So my focus,
You got a couple, 2 minutes.
okay, minute 30, is to continue to do what I can to report back to the industry so that maybe goats could be an option for a young family or folks farming 65 acres to have a viable dairy operation there. And the whole point of Ayers Brook being what it is, as big as it is or whatever, is so that we can go out on a limb on some of this stuff. We're building technical support in the industry. We're sharing information. You know, we're looking at heat reclaiming from compost and then using compost instead of liquid manure as soil amendments. And yeah, I mean, we could go on for a long time here, but okay. So those are my focuses. While the creamery, while that chapter may be written and closed, there are new chapters that may open, and what I am keenly focused on is looking to markets and developing new markets that continue to return the highest value back to the Vermont farmer that is playing his position, her position, to deal with water quality, to employ and provide a livable wage, you know, and you know, be good stewards of their good husbandries of their land, of their animals, and good stewards of their land for 100 years to come. So, yeah.
So I have to say, while Miles was speaking, I thought about a political science professor I had named Frank Bryan. I don't know who here knows that name, but he did write a book in 1983 called Real Vermonters Don't Milk Goats. So I think you've put him to shame on that one, and there's plenty of folks starting to milk goats here in Vermont, but you might want to go talk to him about that at some point. I believe we have at least one microphone set up over here. If anybody wants to hop up and ask a question. If not, I've got plenty of things I can ask and go on about, but I'm curious in terms of, I guess I'll ask a question, and if you do want to ask one, come up to the mic. But if any of you want to discuss sort of that marketplace, Miles, you touched on it. Brent, you talked about it with the growing organic scenario, although my understanding is right now there's about a max right now of demand versus supply, and the organic farmer's milk check is level. It hasn't dropped the way the conventional farm price has. But what's the marketplace or regionality for production? Because in Vermont, my understanding is we only consume about 3 to 5% of the milk that we produce. So how do we get a value out of the marketplace? Where is the marketplace? Whether it's all butter from goats, whether it's organic, is there a different way to get a conventional value out of the marketplace for our conventional brother and sister farmers? What do you see out there going out 20 years? How do we have animals that produce milk in Vermont in the global marketplace?
I'll start off without a whole lot of answers to that, other than our milk goes to Organic Valley, and so it's a co-op, and as grass milk, we're paid a premium on top of that of the organic premium. So we have some of the highest priced milk in the marketplace, and I understand the privilege that affords, and I wish that fairness could be throughout the marketplace. Now, as far as getting a higher presence, you know, fixing the entire milk market, that's definitely beyond the scope of anything which I would hope to embrace. But I do think that there are possibilities in certain you know, opportunities, and one of those that I would see is that most of us as dairy farmers have have the opportunity to produce produce local beef or grass-fed beef. What's really lacking there is a distribution and market mechanism, because we are, if you look at, farmers are very interested in finding some way that they can easily market, and rather than competing with each other in the beef market. We've sat here for, as long as I can remember, decades, moaning about the fact that Vermont is importing their beef from outside of the region, and yet we have all this beef being produced here without any real opportunities that have yet developed to have a marketplace. And I look at the number of dairy farms, which I feel will be going out in the next year, and hoping that there will be some sort of an opportunity for them, at least if the milk market is not going to be fixable, that there'll be other opportunities. And I hate to say that I have no fixes, but I absolutely cannot see any, and I hope that somebody else can come up with something.
Okay, I'll try.
You have 1 million goats in Vermont?
Well, we've got a vision of, one of the reasons we dropped anchor in Randolph, well, we're from Brookfield, so that was kind of easy, but is because Randolph has this incredible concentration of small farms, and it was really in an effort to make sure that stayed in place. Just going back to the question, though, I think it's okay to produce less. You know, one of the big predicaments that, one of the reasons that conventional cow's milk is where it is because you've got animals that are giving you 90 pounds of milk a day. They're, the high concentrate diets, very calculated diets, good management, excellent management. I mean, the reason that there's so much milk is because of many, many years of building and improving year after year. And so it just had the improvements on a dairy farm haven't kept pace with the demand for milk. And so, that's why I really like this grass model. I've grown corn, okay? And, it was one of the things that I said, we experimented with. We've done it both by plowing and we've done it no-till. But I love this kind of, this grass model, because the thing that I always think about all the time, it's always on my mind, is how do we manage risk? How do we make sure that if what we're proposing to do, what we're striving to do doesn't play out the way we hope? How can we walk away? How can we restructure these investments so that they're recoupable? And when you get into a major, there's just a lot of simplicity with the grass, and I think that simplicity mitigates risk. It reduces the number of things that all have to work together exactly right every day in order for you to get paid. And there's so many opportunities for things to go wrong. So that's what I would say. I really like that. I hope the grass market stays very stable, and so, yeah.
Dave, you want to offer something? Then we do have a question from the audience.
Yeah, this is, I'm the last person to talk about agricultural markets, and it's.
Do you eat food?
I do.
Just checking.
I got that going for me. And I happen to know that Lieutenant Governor Zuckerman knows a lot more than the question. He should answer his own question on this, but
I'm the moderator.
There's been, as many of you may know who've been around Vermont for a while, there's been a really an important effort over the last 5+ years, beyond that really, but it's really taken off, the Farm to Plate group, a group of folks organized by Ellen Kaler and some others that have really done some amazing work, and they really brought what I would call ecological thinking to this set of issues around thinking about the farm economy. And I mean, ecological in the sense of ecology is a study of science in which you're examining all the intersections and connections and relationships between all the different aspects of your ecosystem. And it's the same, there's a food ecosystem, there's a farm ecosystem, and it's all intersected. And so this question goes to the, a fundamental issue. It's one thing to say, I can grow hops on my farm. It's an entirely different thing to find somebody to sell it to. And on a consistent way, such that it's worth the investment in the equipment and the learning that goes with growing a new crop. So whatever it is that we're shifting to, we have to make sure that there's markets. And I know that the Farm to Plate folks have done a lot of work and focus around the ideas of food hubs and trying to figure out how do we tackle distribution. And they've had some efforts that have had moderate success. Farm to Schools, for instance, there's a growing recognition that, Vermont is just too small. We need to think about the food shed as being a New England-wide, regional effort. So there's some really concentrated work I know right now being done by some very smart people in the state of Vermont to look at, can we kind of seed, can we facilitate food sheds, can we facilitate food hubs that provide an easy way for our farmers to sell new products that will get to market in more populated parts of southern New England.
And, well, there's a question at the mic, so then I'll come to you, but there's a mic to the side folks can stand. And I want to offer one statistic for people to think about. When I moved my farm from the Intervale, where I was renting land, to buying a conserved farm in Heinsberg, between the farmland, the equipment, and the infrastructure needs we needed to get going, it was a $500,000 investment. A lot of people talk about doctors needing to be paid well because of the cost of medical school. I just want to put all that into perspective. If you want more farmers out there, what it actually costs. And last I checked, most farmers aren't paid the same as doctors. But just something to think about. The costs are much bigger than I think a lot of people realize. Gentlemen.
So my question is more of a statement, and I'm a local farmer. And we have about 40 head of beef cows and 5,000 maple taps. I run it with my wife and 2 daughters, and we also have a restaurant where we serve our products. We also provide whole foods with our meat, and we sell our excess maple syrup to Butternut Mountain Farms. I've been farming since 1992, and the biggest challenge that I've faced in farming is we develop something and then we throw it out the window. And I can state 3 examples of that. One is the Vermont Seal Quality Program that we had about 20 years ago. Excellent program. You could apply for it. There was an inspection process or a set of standards that you followed. It was great to market our maple syrup under, and the program disappeared. 3 years ago, the maple industry thought it was appropriate to take the grading system. The Vermont worked so hard for many years to develop and set themselves apart from Canada, Maine, New York, and we had Vermont Fancy. And we threw it out the window, and we standardized our maple industry with all the other states in our region. And Vermont used to get a 10 cents to 20 cent premium for its wholesale syrup if you sold it wholesale. You don't get that anymore. And then you talk about grass-fed. We're promoting grass-fed, but yet people are coming in and we're standardizing grass-fed now. So, we develop these programs, we see them come to fruition and they're successful, and then we try to reinvent the wheel a few years later and we throw out the programs. So that's the biggest problem that I've faced as a local farmer, is that we get something, it's working, and then we just throw it aside and try to figure out something else. So I would encourage you as people in key roles that, we got to kind of find something that works and then stick with it for a while or a long time.
And there's actually a big discussion about organic standards. The national standards were created. A lot of farmers who were producing organically weren't sure they wanted a national standard because over time it would get watered down. And even this last year, there's been a couple policy decisions made by corporate organic agriculture that are watering down those standards in order to fit the larger scale models of 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 cow farms and 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 layer farms. So I think you've got a point that's pretty important in terms of creating a label with integrity And the Vermont Seal of Quality, just to give some historical perspective on that as well, there was one seal, then there became a second seal, and a third seal, and a fourth seal, and then eventually that was too confusing for the consumer marketplace, so they got rid of all the seals instead of keeping a high standard to get the seal in the first place. So instead of saying, farmers come up to this standard so you earn it, it was, or producers, it was change the seal so there were different levels so that everybody could have a seal, but then that kind of watered down the value.
You know, I'm sorry, can I just interject just for a second? I mean, but embedded in that set of comments was something that is actually one of our great market opportunities, is that, at least to the outside world, when people think of Vermont, whether it's in the rest of this country or frankly the rest of this world, when they think of Vermont, they think quality. They think that they think community. They think that it's healthy. They think clean water. They think all those things that's still associated with our brand, and that is a real opportunity for us. We can't squander it, and we're on the verge, I think, of doing that. But if we're smart about it and we use programs like you describe and we stick with them, it's an opportunity for us to do something that farmers cannot do when they're from Indiana, for example.
Paul, you're up. And Matt, if you do want to speak, come sit up in this chair so I make sure to call you next.
My name is Paul Doughton. I don't know which hat I'm wearing tonight. I wear many of them, including being a dairy farmer. But I'm fortunate enough to have a 32-year-old son that runs the farm when I'm not there. Many times he runs it when I am there, and that's the plan. You talk about brand. I'm also on the Agrimark board. Cabot is a brand that's known more than just in Vermont. My real reason for coming tonight, I'm the chairman of the Connecticut River Watershed Farmers Alliance, and I've been pestering two of the people on your panel to join this group, but they haven't done it yet. Maybe I can shame them into it tonight.
Yeah, I need another nightly meeting like a hole in the head, right?
There are flyers on the table there. We would be very happy to accept membership. It is important to note that there is an organization called Nutrient, a nationwide NEWTRIENT, that Agrimark is part of. They're working to get the snake oil salesman not being able to work in this state anyway, or in the country. We need to have scientific options for water quality issues. Too many farmers have spent many thousands of dollars and there's been no betterment of the water quality. That has been a problem in the past, and it will continue to be until we get real options that are scientifically based. Once again, one size does not fit all. I would also note that this side of the state, the Connecticut River watershed area, is not the polluted side, and that's why I continue to say, don't let one size fit all. And I'm not disparaging the other side of the state. They certainly need help. I am advocating to make sure we get money on this side of the state to make sure our water quality stays as high as it is now.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Matt?
And just a quick question for Brent as a follow-up, but more of a dollars and cents kind of question. I was just curious what the premium that you get as grass-fed on top of being organic, and then if you can speak a little bit about the change of your production levels and whether there is a decrease when the cows switch to pasture-based and whether they eventually caught back up.
Yeah, thank you. So milk is paid on a dollars per hundredweight, and so an extra $5 per hundredweight for the grass-fed premium that Organic Valley pays their farmers, and that's similar to other. There's only a couple other markets that offer that's similar to that amount, and and the lower production for us, we went very gradually. The reduction of grain in our herd. So I didn't notice it as dramatically, but it's typically 10 or 20% lower. So our herd makes 11,000 pounds of milk per year. That's our average, 5% butter fat. So, and typical is much more like 18 or 20,000 is am I okay, Paul?
Are you doing Holsteins as well?
Holsteins, we're up over 20 now as the average. So I'm making half as much milk. And that what Miles was saying, so supply management or somehow control is fundamental in this conversation. And that's been part of the reason that organic has been able to maintain a steady price, is because they've adjusted how much milk that they're willing to take into the market. So new farms coming in. That's not always easy, and it is much easier in a growing market, but as David mentioned, the market is much more flat right now. So without growth there, farmers are asked to predict how much milk that they're going to make in a year, and that's historical by their milk production records. And then if they go over that, they're penalized for it in most of the organic marketplace. And so that's a way of controlling, and I don't think there's been appetite for that in the conventional marketplace for supply management. Been a lot of conversation over my lifetime, but it hasn't happened or there's not serious consideration of that now. So.
Yeah, and just to kind of springboard off that a little more, you know, if we look to a model where we're not trying to make, you know, some of these high production herds that are milked 3 times a day are making close to 30,000 pounds of milk. If we start to, and mind you,
That's per cow.
per cow,
Not everybody knows the term.
per cow per year, okay, 30,000 pounds of milk. And the creameries are, I mean, Paul would be able to answer this question better, but are dumping milk on a regular basis. So we do all those trips around the field, take the soil samples, spread the nutrients, go and harvest it, feed it to the animals, you know, pay the employees, try to remember to turn the milk tank on, and then they dump the milk. So, you know, to me, it seems like, okay, let's look at a model that doesn't require as much purchase feed, doesn't require as many off-farm inputs, is a simpler model with lower risk, less moving parts, and lower production. And, you know, the fact that we're only consuming 3% of the milk in state, you know, that's a significant number. And I think we need to pay attention to that.
Please.
Forget your herd averages.
Thank you, and my appreciation for Vermont Law School for putting this on. It's a really important forum, and to each one of you who've come out this evening. There was a comment made, we need to work as community, and I just want to echo that, and I can't help but be curious how many just strictly consumers there are in the audience this evening. I think a lot of people might, if you're not a student, maybe have an ag hat or an ag association, but it is getting this sort of message and staying with it out to the marketplace itself. And it's not just the pretty farm photos, which have an impact, but it is the story of the worker. It is the story of everything that the farmers are doing for the environment. And they are stewards day in, day out. They live there, and you do. And so I think as we look for ways to carry this message forward, it is to close that gap between the consumer, because lots of things can have the local label thrown on it, whether it's local or not, but when it has the local impact, that's the story that people start to say, that is my community, and those people are my neighbors. So I think this evening's forum is great, and I'm eager to find other ways to continue to help share this story. So thank you all, and again, thank you to the law school.
Hey, David.
Go right ahead.
I'd just like to add something that I kind of got derailed on and forgot to say a minute ago. And that is that if we look to a lower production model, we're dealing with less nutrients. We're dealing with less potential for nutrient loss into our waterways. When we continue to strive for a high production, high management model, that relies heavily on grain from the Midwest, which is nutrients that we're importing to our state all the time. And so, you know, taking a broader, you know, maybe 5,000 foot look at this could be a solution to both supply management and a water quality issue. And the fact that we're milking, you got some farms milking 23 hours a day, so of course they're relying on migrant labor. And it's a vicious cycle. It's a vicious cycle. Yeah.
So, oh, did you have a? Oh, there's another microphone. All right, we've got just a couple minutes left, so if we do some quick questions, quick answers, and then we'll do like a 1-minute speed round for dating at the end here. Go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sarah, and I'm a 3L here at Vermont Law School. And I was struck by what was said earlier in the panel that farmers are stewards of the lands, and so it's not seemingly an intentional workers' rights issue or violation. It's not like an intentional, we want to pollute this river that supports us. And so I was wondering, for Migrant Justice, when you go and you speak to these farms and the farmers, how you approach that discussion with them about, hey, like the people that work with you are having some issues. And then also from a farm perspective, from an environmental perspective, what does that discussion look like, and what's the best way to receive that? What's the best way to receive the, hey, you're not really in compliance kind of discussion? Thanks.
Good question.
Quick question.
Short answer is it depends. Generally, as we've kind of dug in over time, one of the first things Migrant Justice did back in 2011 was create a workers' rights support line, which was an important resource because it was a Spanish-speaking line. We provided our number, did outreach, got it out in the hands of workers, and we receive hundreds of calls, and they range from all sorts of things. But our first response as the systems have developed is our first effort is always to speak directly with the farmer and interpret and attempt to problem solve. And it's you've seen maybe, and we've been kind of we've heard some of this feedback that Migrant Justice has been probably in the news with a specific issue on a specific farm maybe 3 times in our 7-year history. So it's only when everything else has broken down, really, everything has been tried, even the state, has failed workers, which it does a lot. It doesn't have the resources, for one, to enforce labor laws. Workers are excluded from many labor protections, agricultural workers. So as it's a last resort option, but what we're really most excited about is all of that took place in a context without the Milk with Dignity program. So now the new situation is one in which if a farm is in Ben & Jerry's supply chain, that discussion is people with equal voice at a table, problem solving with a resource. Ben & Jerry's is saying it's important these problems get resolved. That's key to convey that from the market. And then farmers are being incentivized and get a premium for their milk for participating. And we have an explicit element in our code of conduct that explicitly says there can be no retaliation against workers for participating in the Milk with Dignity program. So that conversation now can be one amongst equals, whereas that was a case-by-case basis previously. That a lot of times that worked on farms, but when it didn't, there was kind of no recourse. But the Milk with Dignity program kind of redraws those relationships. And we think for the long haul, it's a great resource. And I think it's good to be up here. I think when we're talking about the kind of Vermont brand and the Vermont marketing, I think that consumers care how workers are treated. And I think that Vermont can think of this as an opportunity, but it needs to be real. So it needs to be traceable, it needs to be accountable. There needs to be these systems in place that really provide a consumer with some assurance that in fact, workers are being treated fairly. And I'm not trying to generalize here because that's not how we've tried to convey the problem. But what we're saying is now we have a solution, so we want more brands to get on board to help drive some of this change, and we believe there's a market for it. And in fact, we're having some discussions with other brands about expanding.
And David, maybe briefly, you could talk about how do you find a farm when they already have no money? I think there was actually a story just the last couple of days of a farm in northern Vermont that built a huge new facility without a permit. How does that jive in the political enforcement world?
Well, let me step back slightly, and then I'll dive into that question. This will count as my concluding remarks too, so I'll wrap it all together. But
the last question.
when I look at water quality issues around the state of Vermont, and in particular the agricultural contribution, and I look at farms, I don't see them as the problem. I see them as a potential solution. A well-managed farm with good soils and good nutrient management is actually a huge asset on our landscape. It's a place that can store and hold organic material, that can store and hold nutrients and recycle them and make use out of the land. A well-managed farm holds moisture, holds rainfall on the ground, and reduces flood risk. There's a lot of really positive things that come from a well-managed farm. So when I look at it, I don't look at a farm, I see a problem, I see an opportunity. The second thing that I'll note for context, and I'll get back to the enforcement question, is that I remember in 1983 or 4, I was in college. I took a course from a professor, Daniel Sisler, who is an amazing agricultural economist, well-respected, widely regarded, and wrote some really amazing, far-reaching, and in retrospect, it's like he had a crystal ball. He looked at farm policy at that time and the trajectory it was on, and he said, this is a disaster for farmers. This is a disaster for our food system. We're on this cycle in which the commodity farmers have only one choice if they're gonna stay ahead of the curve, which is to grow, to go to more inputs, more fertilizers, larger equipment, larger farms, larger herds, and it's a cycle that has continued on and on and on. And it has not been successful in the sense of we don't have a lot of farmers out there getting rich. They've gotten bigger, and a lot of farmers are going out of business, and a lot of the small and mid-sized farms are on the margins. And that's because of the economic system. So then you step in with the environmental regulations and a set of water quality requirements, and we say you, small farmer, mid-sized farmer, or large farmer, now have to comply at a point in which the economic system that you're operating in already has you on the margins. And that puts the environmental regulators in the position of being the ones that may be putting a farm out of business, which nobody wants to do. Nobody wants to do it because farming is part of our culture, it's part of our community. These are important people and important businesses to the local economies and the state economy. Nobody wants to do that. Nonetheless, you have to have some accountability. You have to have some way of ensuring that the pollution problems don't simply get worse. And there are always people, like the folks in the farm you refer to, that are just fine ignoring the rules. You know, there's like that's, you know, it doesn't mean all farmers are rotten. It means a few of them are. A few of them are making mistakes that they shouldn't. They're getting careless in ways that we need a system of accountability. And that's where the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation and the Agency of Agriculture come in and to say, hey, here's the rules, you need to follow them. But it is not simple. And a lot of those farmers, you know, when you say that a farmer's polluting and they violate the rules, it assumes that the rules are clear and understandable, which they're not. It assumes that the farmers, someone took the time to explain the rules to the farmers, which we don't do a very good job, particularly for the small and mid-sized farmers. So there's a lot of work that should happen, that before someone shows up on your farm to hand you an enforcement order and say, pay a fine, they should have been out there a dozen or more times before that to help you as the farmer work through what you need to do to come into compliance. And that's something that I know that the state is currently working really hard to do, to put in place that soup to nuts process in which we provide assistance, technical assistance and support, and economic and financial assistance and planning. So at the end of the day, if you're still not making it, it's not because you didn't have a chance or didn't understand the rules, it's because you chose not to.
And we really have to wrap up. And Marley was next in line, but this young lady came up, and I'm wondering if you could.
Two.
Just one, so. Well,
I'm fine with it.
if we're all good with it and the audience is fine, we'll take these 2 questions, and that's fine, but. Absolutely. I don't disagree. So we'll do those 2 if people have the patience. That's great.
Well, I apologize ahead of time for asking a question after 7 o'clock that really has no answer within tonight's context, I'm sure. But maybe, Lori, it'll set the stage for another discussion here at the law school. David, you said earlier that farmers need to be innovative to stay in business. I'll also argue that policymakers need to be innovative. And I think the question that I'll throw out to you is more related to the policy of how to do what several of you have suggested, which is downsize, be smaller, milk less, produce less. David, you had to pay $500,000 to go into business. Chances are you didn't have that money in your back pocket. Right. There is debt involved, substantial debt. How can we in government, we as nonprofit organizations that work with farmers, programs like Farm Viability, UVM Extension, how can those programs help farmers transition from a very high debt load to the type of lifestyle and marketing and production that you're talking about? Again, unanswerable at 10 after 7, but I'd be happy to hear the answers over here if you want to share it later too.
Well, I will offer a brief thought as I think the policymaker of the bunch here at this point, although I no longer am in the legislature, so I can't write any bills, just to make sure y'all know that. I've been talking for a while about, and it was referenced earlier, about the name Vermont and the possible marketing of that brand in and of itself, and not forcing a lot of our conventional farms to, I don't think we should force them to do anything in terms of all farms have to go organic. There isn't the market, it would flood the market. But I do think the Vermont name, if affiliated with either a workers' rights standard or a water quality standard or a couple benchmarks that the state could augment a marketing plan to the Southern New England market to extract, frankly, a better price out of the marketplace, not maybe the premium of organic or a marketplace like goat, but with a volume or maybe a smaller volume, could extract a better value out of the marketplace, because the state itself doesn't have the resources. We're talking about a $2 to $2.5 billion annual cash flow situation. We just don't have that. We do have, as you pointed out, some of these technical assistance type programs. We also have the conservation easements that have been going on for a long time that made the opportunity possible for me to go in at 500. The land had another 650 in developmental value, or something to that effect, I'm not exactly sure, that the land trust purchased, so the farm I bought the land from didn't lose their legacy investment, which is what a lot of farmers have, that where they make their money is in the legacy value of that land. So Vermont is actually ahead of the curve on a lot of those things. I think our next innovative step is to try to circle the wagons with a number of farmers. And right now, this thought is outside the box, and there's a lot of resistance. The only farmers that are actually talking about supply management now, and they're starting to, is some of those 2,000 and 3,000 and 4,000 cow farms, because they know, for them, there's really no going back to a smaller scale. So if, at least in the grand scheme of things, the volume doesn't keep growing, then eventually they'll have a demand-side management or supply-side management system. But getting 800 farmers or 600 non-organic dairy farmers to agree to a system is tricky. But I think we have to come up with something innovative, or we're going to have a very different landscape in 20 years.
Hi there, Jennifer Byrne, I'm a student here. I heard a comment about, the sort of the lack of science behind some of the, or environmental science behind, on-farm conservation efforts. And it seems to me like it's more of our shotgun approach that's not giving us any good data, where we're, putting conservation on the land in, various areas. So we're not really seeing that water quality improvement. So I wonder, instead of putting the burden on the farmer to implement those types of practices, how can Vermont as a state, help supplement that?
I can give a quick answer to that, but there's actually quite a lot of work that's been done by UVM Extension, by the state, at different agencies, and it's not rocket science in the sense of we know what works, allowing the, cover cropping, ways of making sure that the rain and precipitation stay on the land, not applying more nutrients than the crops and the soil can absorb and take up. So not that there isn't room for more science and more study and more work, but we know a lot about what needs to be done. And there's a kind of a regulatory, part of the regulatory program that's in place now anticipates something called nutrient management planning, where you go farm by farm and work with the farmers to evaluate what's the nitrogen needs, what are the phosphorus needs on the land, what are the slopes, what are the kinds of cropping mechanisms that you should use. But there's a lot of different farms with a lot of different landscapes. You know, as Miles pointed out, there's hillside farms and there's farms down in the valley, very, very different needs. And trying to help manage the complexity of the different types of farming, the different landscapes, different soils, all of that is tough and has to be done farm by farm. So I think there's definitely room for more investment in doing that kind of work on a farm-to-farm basis, and that's part of what has happened over the last 5 or 6 years is a substantial increase in that work.
I think the Agency of Agriculture's Best Management Practices grant match program to help farmers build manure storages are absolutely critical. You know, it's one thing to mandate new rules, but you got to be there with some resources to help a farmer get compliant and implement. Going back to a question just a minute ago here about how to talk to farmers about the enforcement side, I think when you start talking numbers, dollar figures, you get guys' attention. Nutrient management plans can be incredibly cumbersome, especially for our older generation that hadn't grown up with computers. It can be a real bear to have all your soil samples from all your fields and plan it out so that you're in compliance. But if you start talking about the economic benefits of keeping a nutrient management plan, like for me, for instance, my nutrient management plan told me that I have a massive surplus of manure that I can now compost and sell as another source of income on the farm, instead of just going and spending the money and diesel fuel to go blast it on the fields unnecessarily. So, you know, that you gotta start talking about how it's gonna positively impact the farmer's bottom line, and I think that's how you really get guys' attention.
I can back that up because Miles sold me some of his manure, and now I'm out $1,400, so it worked for him. I also wanted to address your question a little bit about how do we have this conversation when someone's out of compliance, or someone's, I think you said, when someone says to you, you know, what you're a farmer, what are you doing wrong, and what are you going to do about it? And I think part of it is that we have to humbly recognize that we all have work to do. Someone recently told me that, you know, if you're not part of the problem, you're not part of the solution. And I think too often we tend to go back and defend ourselves, but we all really do have work to do. I believe in my model of grass farming. I think it's a great thing, but there's lots of other models that people are going to approach it from a different angle. And I think historically we haven't been willing to seed ground and to look at other approaches. And it's through that community approach, I think, that we're going to move forward. And we're making progress. These nutrient management plans are happening, but it's very difficult, as Miles said, to get a bunch of farmers to do these plans. But there's really possibilities because there's a lot of young people that are willing to help with that planning process, and there's an income opportunity as well.
Thank you so much all for coming. My name is Nico Lustig. I'm a student here at Vermont Law School and very interested in agriculture and what the future could look like for it. And in a policy-minded aspect, you had mentioned the need for standardization for the definition or term of what grass-fed means. And I'm wondering if that could be addressed at a state level or if the goal would be better served at a federal level or under the new definition of the redefined regenerative agriculture, which might be the new kind of organic certification model.
There is actually a national standard for grass-fed, including dairy, and so our farm is double inspected for grass-fed. So it's been a development process, but it's arriving, and same for beef.
And I just want to add that it's important with all the different labels not to get them confused. because you can have regenerative ag, which is a great rotational grazing and carbon sinking kind of system of agriculture, but you may well also use synthetic fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, and other chemicals, which is a long way from being organic. In the marketplace today, there are farms that sell GMO-free meats, and people think that's organic light when it's often not remotely close to organic. So I think all these labels are important, but as consumers, really understanding what they mean and not jumping on any particular label as meaning a lot more than what it does mean is important. As an organic producer who's competing in all of these different organic light terminology, and I think earlier the term natural wine, there's legally no definition for the word natural, for those that don't know that. So there is a definition. Someone else brought up the word local. In Vermont, we do have a definition. It's within the borders of the state or within 25 miles of the border of the state. So if someone is slapping the word local on and it's not, that's actually illegal and can be brought to the state's attention. So that's a difficult balance of all these different labels that mean all these different things. And each of you as consumers have different, for lack of a better term, litmus tests of what's most important. It might be the workers' rights. It might be the animal husbandry. It might be pastured and sequestering carbon. It might be water quality. It might be herbicides or pesticides. It might be some combination of all of those. And so it's a bit of a confusing situation out there as well. And I'm going to sort of leave it on that confusing note and probably not do the wrap minute if you folks are all set or okay with that. But I do think there's incredible potential in Vermont. And you have many, many more people, including many more people that are not white males, who are farming in the state of Vermont and who have innovative ideas, who work both independently and collaboratively with many other farmers, who buy manure from each other. There's another word for that. But who, you know, we have an incredible network between extension and state programs, organizations and co-ops. And if there is a state that's situated to figure it out, Vermont's it. We have a 70 million person marketplace within 12-hour drive of every farm in Vermont. And so I want to thank Vermont Law School and all the wonderful organizers, and good luck with your baby. And Sarah, who's, yeah. So Sarah and Margaret, and so many who have put this together, and the food that was donated and or provided by Vermont Law School, and all of you for coming out for this conversation. Thank you for the evening.